The conversation continues at larslarson.com.
Welcome back to the program. Glad to have you with me on this Monday, the first business day of the new Trump administration. And on the phone with me right now, it's a great pleasure to welcome to the program Alexander Vershbow, who is former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the former U.S. Ambassador to both NATO and Russia. Ambassador, it's good to have you on the program. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
So tell me this, what should we be doing to try to address this war that you pointed out is grinding away in Ukraine?
Well, we have to continue to do what we can to support Ukraine, which is really the victim of aggression by Russia. And that means giving them material support, helping them with their economy, but in particular providing political support in terms of pressuring the Russians to agree to disengage and restore sovereignty to the occupied parts of eastern Ukraine. So that means we got to keep the sanctions in effect, which we and the Europeans have imposed, until the Russians actually meet the conditions for lifting those sanctions.
So for all the talk there was about concern that Donald Trump would somehow, be in bed with Vladimir Putin, why is it that the Obama administration never did took the steps you just mentioned?
Well, they tried, and I think we prevented the Russians from going any further in terms of occupying other parts of Ukraine. So I think the sanctions have worked, but sanctions are an imperfect weapon, and they didn't actually lead to a complete reversal of Russian behavior. And I think in the last year, to be honest, the Russians were kind of waiting out the Obama administration, hoping to see whether they might get a better deal from the next U.S. administration. But I think that it would be quite damaging in the long term if we were to basically give the Russians their say over their neighbors and reestablish a kind of sphere of influence. It would only embolden them to go further and lead to trouble down the road.
Do you think there's a real danger that the Trump administration will do that they'll cave on sanctions, maybe in exchange for reducing the arsenal of nuclear weapons?
Well, there's been some statements that have created a lot of questions, more questions than answers about that. I mean, on the one hand, the statements by Rex Tillerson and Jim Mattis in their confirmation hearings have suggested a certain kind of vigilance about Russia, no illusions about Russia. But the president himself has to be diplomatic, been all over the map. So I think we need to see a little more clarity about this. I think that you have to stand by certain principles. The countries shouldn't be allowed to bite off a piece of their neighbors using military force and get away with it. So, yes, we should improve the relationship with Russia, but not at any price.
Let me ask you something. As much as he has been all over the map on this issue and a few others, and that it confuses people like me because I think, well, I thought he was going this direction. Now he's going that direction. When it comes to dealing with adversaries like Russia, is it necessarily a good idea to telegraph all of your moves through public statements, or might it be an advantage to be a bit all over the map so the Russians are also in the dark about where we might go and what we will do? I'm trying to ask a layperson's question about diplomacy. So forgive me, Ambassador, but is it a good idea maybe to leave them wondering? We don't know where he's going to go, and that's good for us and not necessarily good for the Russians.
Well, that can be helpful for a time in terms of preparing the battlefield for serious negotiations. But eventually you have to kind of put your basic principles on the table. You don't have to reveal your bottom line right up front, but you have to make very clear that certain things are non-negotiable, such as the sovereignty of countries like Ukraine with 50 million people or Georgia with 8 million people, that we're not just going to kind of throw them to the wolves for the sake of other concessions on Russia's part. So that's where I hope sooner or later we'll get more clarity.
I'm just curious, from your position as a former Deputy Secretary of NATO, do you still have concerns that were the kind of concerns that were raised during the campaign when people said, gosh, Donald Trump wants to do away with NATO? I read it as Donald Trump wants the other members of NATO to pay their fair share. I'd like to get your take on that while I've got your ear.
Yeah. No, I think that there's certainly a basis to ask the allies to do more, both in defense spending, but also in actually carrying out some of the different missions of NATO. NATO's not just a military alliance. It could be doing a lot more to help in Iraq, to train the Iraqi military, to help countries like Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia, maybe even Libya, to kind of stand up to the terrorists and in the end prevent the need to have to go in a big way with military intervention. So I'm going to put my hopes on the more positive statements from the president when he said that NATO is very important to him, and that he simply wants NATO to be more effective and more useful in actually solving problems.
Is there a reason that NATO hasn't been sort of reformed prior to this? That we say, well, it was essentially it came about as part of the Cold War, post World War II. But is there a reason that nobody's had the guts to say we need to make big changes before now? And maybe we need to congratulate Trump for being the guy to stand up and say this has got to, it's not necessarily a bad organization. It just needs to do a job differently in a new era.
Yeah. Well, actually, if you look more closely at what NATO's been doing since the end of the Cold War, which is more than 25 years now, it has been changing and transforming itself. It's kind of gone through 3 or 4 different changes of identity. First, it shifted from defending against the Russian threat to integrating Europe, ending the wars in the former Yugoslavia. Then after 9/11, our allies came to our defense, and they've sent troops to fight the Taliban. They've taken more than 1,000 casualties. So NATO has been changing, but it's always a little sluggish. It's a large organization where you have to get a unanimity to take any decisions. So it's a good organization, but it could be made even better. So I think there's some way to have a meeting of the minds between President Trump and the allies on preserving what works, but actually adding some new skills and new capabilities to NATO so it's even better in the future.
Ambassador Vershbow, while we're going to be at odds with them over things like Ukraine, and I have a feeling that's not going to end, is there a point to be made about Trump's suggestion that if we can find a way to work with Russia on some things like opposing ISIS, opposing the Islamic State, that's worthwhile if they're willing to go the same direction or seek the same goals as we have?
Absolutely, and I don't think anyone has been closing the door to working with Russia on those issues where we can find some common ground. And we both should be working harder to prevent North Korea from acquiring a deliverable nuclear weapon. And that means perhaps both of us putting more heat on China to lean on its client in North Korea to do that. There may be different fronts in the war against terrorism where we could work together. But in Syria, for example, the Russians say they're fighting terror, but really they're propping up the regime of President Assad and basically bombing indiscriminately both the moderate opposition and the terrorists. So we need to be clear what we're going to get from the Russians. Reciprocity is a popular word in diplomacy. We need to make sure that what we give is reciprocated by the Russians. And we also have to avoid what I would call a dirty trade-off, sort of trading Russian cooperation on an issue like terrorism for the sovereignty of Ukraine. There's certain principles that we shouldn't compromise on, and that's the sovereignty of independent countries like Ukraine, like Georgia, who have been the victims of aggression by Putin's Russia.
And Mr. Ambassador, it's a pleasure to have you on the program. Thanks a lot for being a clear-spoken advocate for these things, and I appreciate your time.
You're very welcome.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Alexander Vershbow, who's the former Deputy Secretary of NATO and the former U.S. Ambassador to both NATO and Russia. When we come back, chaos